The rain had just started tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows of James Whitmore's penthouse office when his assistant quietly knocked and entered, holding a pale yellow envelope in trembling hands. Her eyes, usually composed, gave away more than her words ever could. "Mr. Whitmore, it's from Maple Falls." James didn't need to ask. There was only one person who would still send anything from that forgotten speck of a town: Eleanor. His mother. The name alone tugged at a place in his chest he'd kept barricaded for a decade. He hadn't spoken to her since that final, blistering phone call 10 years ago. The one where voices were raised, accusations were hurled, and something irreparable cracked between them. That was before the promotions, before the magazine covers and interviews, before he became a man whose life looked enviable from the outside. The envelope was simple. No return address. Just his name, written in Eleanor's distinct, looping script, like time itself hadn't passed. He didn't open it. The phone call came hours later, as James sat alone in his glass-walled kitchen with a drink in hand and the envelope untouched beside him. A quiet voice, warm but professional, informed him that Eleanor Whitmore had passed away the night before. Peacefully, they said. In her sleep. The funeral was to be held in 2 days, and she'd left specific instructions, including a request for her son's presence. James didn't answer immediately. He simply stared at the skyline, thinking of the last time he saw her face, the way she'd looked at him, not with anger, but with sorrow, like she already knew she was losing him. Reluctantly, James returned to Maple Falls. The town hadn't changed. It still smelled of pine and earth and carried a stillness that made his heartbeat feel like thunder. Strangers watched him like a ghost had returned, the successful son who'd never come back. His family home, now cold and lifeless, greeted him with silence. Dust-blanketed old furniture. The air was tinged with lavender and something else. Grief long settled into the walls. After the service, the lawyer handed James a small wooden box. Inside was another envelope. This one was thicker, heavier. It bore a single instruction. For James, only open when I'm gone. Hands slightly trembling, James opened it. Inside was a letter. Eleanor's handwriting once again filling the page with aching familiarity. But tucked behind it was something far more unsettling. A hand-drawn map, worn at the edges, marked with a single red X in a part of town James didn't recognize. Cliffhanger. He stared at the map, feeling the first stirring of something he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity, and beneath that, dread. What had his mother left behind that couldn't be spoken, only discovered? A map to the past. The map haunted him. Even as James folded it neatly and slipped it into his coat pocket, it felt like something alive, like it breathed with secrets too long buried. That night, sleep refused to come. He lay in his childhood bedroom, the same faded wallpaper, the same creaky floors, listening to the wind whistle outside and wondering how a simple drawing could feel so heavy. By morning, he was on the road, driving his rental car past fields he hadn't seen since boyhood. The map led him away from town, past rusting fences and crooked mailboxes, down a dirt road nearly consumed by pine trees and silence. No signs, no people. Just the steady crunch of tires over gravel and the sound of his own breath growing shallow. Eventually, the road gave way to a small clearing. There, nestled among towering trees and wild overgrowth, stood a weathered cabin, barely visible behind curtains of ivy and thyme. The roof sagged in places, and a faint smell of damp wood and moss hung in the air. Eleanor's cabin. James approached slowly, as if afraid the ground might collapse beneath him. The front door wasn't locked. It creaked open with a groan, revealing a space lost in time. The cabin was a strange blend of chaos and intimacy. Dust motes danced in beams of sunlight filtering through cracked blinds. A wood-burning stove sat cold in the corner, next to a worn armchair and a stack of old quilts. But what caught his eye, what rooted him in place, were the walls. They were covered in portraits, dozens of them, all of a young boy, sketched in pencil, painted in acrylics, drawn with charcoal. The boy aged gradually, from maybe 5 years old to a teenager. James didn't recognize the face, but the expression was hauntingly familiar, thoughtful, sad, alone. On a nearby desk sat stacks of journals, each one neatly labeled with dates that stretched back nearly 20 years. He picked one up at random. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's. He smiled today, that rare half smile that reminds me of Richard. I worry I won't be able to keep him hidden much longer. But what choice do I have? The world wouldn't understand. James's heart kicked in his chest. Who was she writing about? And why had she never told him? He read deeper into the journal. The boy's name was Daniel. She called him my light in the dark, and wrote of secret birthdays, hushed lullabies, and moments of fear. It sounded like she was raising him, but not as a mother in the open, more like in hiding. James rifled through more pages, desperate for a photo, a clue, anything. He didn't find a photograph, but he did find something chilling. Tucked in the final page of one journal was a handwritten line. They must never find out who he really is. Cliffhanger. James stared at the words, pulse racing. Who was Daniel, and what had Eleanor been protecting or hiding all these years? Who is Daniel? The name echoed in James's head like a siren. Daniel. He'd said it aloud several times now, testing its weight, trying to connect it to a face or memory, but there was nothing. No childhood friend. No cousin, no neighbor. Just the boy in those paintings and the pages of Eleanor's journals. Someone treated with such fierce affection, as if he were Eleanor's very own child. That thought unsettled him. He returned to the cabin every day for the next week, unable to tear himself away. Something about the place and the presence of this mysterious boy drew him in, as if the air itself whispered things Eleanor never said aloud. He read journal after journal, tracing Daniel's life from toddler to teenager. The entries became more frantic over time, as if Eleanor had been preparing for something, or fearing someone would come looking. In one journal she wrote, "He looks more like Richard every day. God forgive me, but I see it in his eyes. Sometimes I wish I could rewind time, undo everything, but then I hear Daniel laugh, and I remember why I made the choice I did." Who was Richard? James didn't recognize the name, but it gnawed at him, the way Eleanor spoke about him, with guilt and longing. Back in town, James began asking questions. Discreetly at first, until his frustration got the better of him. He visited the town library, the diner, even the church his mother once attended. He spoke to the elderly pastor, now half-blind and forgetful, and a few neighbors who hadn't seen Eleanor in years. One conversation stuck with him. It was with Martha Green, the town's retired postmistress. She remembered Eleanor vividly, and not kindly. She used to vanish for days at a time, Martha said, pursing her lips over her coffee. After her husband died, she'd walk those woods like a ghost, always with a scarf over her belly. One winter, she came back looking different, heavier, then thinner again, never said a word. James pressed. "Do you think she was pregnant?" Martha raised an eyebrow. "I'm not saying anything, but the way she looked, and how secretive she got." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Some say she went off and had a baby. Hid him. Maybe out there in that cabin. Wouldn't surprise me. She always had a flair for dramatics." The rumors grew thicker the more he asked. Some said Eleanor had gone mad. Others said she had a child with a man who wasn't her husband. But all the stories agreed on one thing. She'd gone to great lengths to keep that part of her life in the shadows. That night, back at the cabin, James couldn't sleep. He found himself pacing the creaky floorboards, his thoughts spiraling. He needed proof. He tore up a loose floorboard near the hearth, half by instinct, half by desperation, and found it. A slim envelope, wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture. Inside, a birth certificate. Male, born 1991. Mother, Eleanor Whitmore. Father, listed as unknown, but something about the paper felt off. Holding it up to the lamplight, James noticed slight irregularities. The ink in some places bolder than others, like parts of it had been erased and written over. Sloppily. Amended. Altered. Cliffhanger. James stared at the certificate, his skin cold. Why would Eleanor fake her own son's parentage? And more importantly, what was she trying to hide? The man in the picture. The birth certificate burned a hole in James's thoughts for days. He kept staring at the father's section, unknown, but someone had clearly known. Someone had scratched out and retyped details, leaving ghostly traces of names that once were there. James became consumed with one question: who was Daniel's father? He returned to the cabin yet again, this time scouring every drawer, every box, every forgotten corner. That's when he found a worn envelope tucked inside an old dictionary, hidden in a carved-out hollow. Inside was a photograph, creased and yellowed with age. It was Eleanor smiling. She looked younger, happier, her eyes lit with a kind of warmth James barely remembered. And beside her stood a man, tall, strong-jawed, dark-haired, with a hand on her shoulder like they belonged to each other. They stood in front of the cabin. On the back, in Eleanor's looping script, it read, R. Hall, Fall 90. James's heart thudded. R. Hall. Could that be Richard, the man mentioned in her journals? The one who, if whispers were true, had vanished without a trace? James took the photo into town the next day. The library was dusty and quiet, and Mrs. Dobbins, the local historian and librarian, had just brewed a pot of bitter tea when he showed her the picture. She squinted at it through thick glasses, and after a moment, her lips parted slightly. "Oh my, that's Richard Hall, yes, good heavens!" James leaned in. "You knew him?" "We all did. He worked at the mill before it shut down. Bit of a loner. Charming, though. I remember he and Eleanor were close. Too close, some would say, considering she was married. Then, one day, poof, gone. Some said he ran off. Others think something happened in those woods." James felt his throat tighten. Like what? Like he found something. Or someone. He shouldn't have. And Eleanor stopped talking about him. Completely. Wouldn't even say his name. That night, James couldn't shake the idea. If Richard was Daniel's father, then what had happened to him? He mailed a DNA test in for himself, just to chase away the gnawing feeling in his gut. The results came back days later, and they floored him. Richard Hall was not Daniel's father. He was James's. The ground seemed to lurch beneath him. His memories of childhood, his mother and the man he thought was his father, twisted suddenly into something he couldn't trust. Had Eleanor lied to him his entire life? Cliffhanger. Reeling from the revelation, James stared at the image of Richard Hall, now knowing that the man beside his mother was his real father. But if Richard wasn't Daniel's father, then who was? And what happened in those woods that made Eleanor erase him from every version of the story? A family built on lies. The discovery about Richard Hall left James reeling. His entire understanding of his own family, the man who raised him, the mother he'd barely spoken to in years, fractured. If Richard was his biological father, then everything James had known about his family's dynamics was a lie. And if Eleanor had kept that secret from him all his life, what else had she hidden? The next logical step was to confront someone who might know more. His aunt, Mildred Whitmore, Eleanor's only surviving sibling, was dying. Her health had been in sharp decline for years, and James knew this was probably his last chance to get answers. He wasn't prepared for what he found when he stepped into her dimly lit living room. The scent of stale cigarettes and antiseptic filled the air. Mildred sat in a recliner, hooked up to an oxygen tank, her frail hands shaking as she adjusted the edge of a blanket. "Mildred," James said gently, "I need to know about Richard Hall. About Eleanor." Her eyes flickered with recognition, but she didn't immediately speak. The silence stretched between them like a web, heavy and fraught with unspoken history. "Eleanor always kept things close to the chest," she finally murmured, her voice weak but steady. "But I know enough, or maybe I knew more than I should have." She paused, her eyes clouding with something like regret. "She never told you the truth, did she?" James shook his head, his heart pounding as he leaned forward. "What truth?" "Your mother wasn't always the person you thought she was," Mildred rasped. "She had an affair with Richard Hall years before your father died. I didn't know much, but I knew enough to know she loved him, and after Richard vanished, she disappeared for months. When she came back, she was different, changed, quiet. And that's when she started acting strangely around you." James felt his blood run cold. What do you mean by strangely? Mildred sighed, her tired eyes avoiding his. She was hiding something. You were never supposed to know about Daniel. Never. He was Richard's son, James. But after Richard's death, well, that's when your mother made a choice. She wanted to protect you from the truth. She thought it was better that way. But the burden of it broke her. James stared at her, trying to process. She hid Daniel? From everyone? Mildred nodded, her voice trembling. After Richard died, and don't ask me how, Eleanor was there, James. She was there when he died. They were in those woods, together. It was an accident. It wasn't planned, but it happened. And she was left with 2 sons. One she could claim, and the other. She stopped, shaking her head. The other had to disappear. Suddenly, it all made sense, but it made no sense at all. Eleanor had kept 2 lives, one for James and one for Daniel. She'd erased Richard from the picture, turned his memory into a ghost, and replaced it with her own version of the past. She'd made herself the martyr, the one who had to sacrifice everything for the sake of keeping her family whole. Do you think she killed him? James's voice cracked as the words escaped his lips. Mildred turned to him, eyes wide. I don't know, but she was terrified. You should have seen her, James. The guilt. She carried it all these years and it poisoned everything. James stumbled back, his knees weak. The weight of his mother's past, her sins, her silence, her sacrifices, crushed him. The world he thought he knew, the family he thought he was a part of, was nothing but a fragile illusion. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. Startled, James turned to see a man standing on the threshold, a familiar face he hadn't expected to see. The sheriff. Sheriff? James asked, his voice thick with confusion. I need to speak with you, James, the sheriff said, his tone serious. It's Daniel's whereabouts. The sheriff's sudden visit had shaken James, but what lingered longer was the official document in his hands. Richard Hall's cold case reopened. It wasn't just a family secret anymore. Now it was a potential criminal investigation. But James couldn't dwell on that. Not yet. He was haunted by a face he'd never seen in real life. The face of Daniel, a boy rendered in charcoal and ink across Eleanor's journals and sketchbooks. The drawings were so intimate, so full of love and longing, that James had begun to feel like he knew him. And yet, Daniel remained a ghost. No records, no mentions in town, not even a grave. If Eleanor had sent him into hiding, where? James returned to the cabin and began examining the drawings again, this time with a detective's eye. He noticed something strange. In every sketch of Daniel, the boy had the same. It took hours, dozens of grainy photographs, dozens of boys. Then, there he was. A teenage boy, thin and hollow-eyed, standing beside a social worker's desk in a photo dated 2004. His name on the file, Thomas Grant. A child placed in the system after being found wandering near the edge of the state line. No family claimed him, and there it was. The crescent birthmark. Daniel. James traced the file, but something was off. The boy's record abruptly ended at age 17. No adoption, no transfer, just one line. Discharged, independent, then nothing. Vanished. He tried calling state agencies. Inside was a single postcard, old and faded, the kind you'd buy from a dusty tourist gift shop. The picture showed a scenic overlook with mountains in the background and a diner in the corner. But it was the handwriting on the back that turned James's blood to ice. Thought you might come looking eventually. This isn't where I am, but the daughter's letter. James hadn't spoken to his daughter Lily in nearly 2 years. It wasn't a blowout fight or a dramatic falling out. It was silence, a silence that stretched into days, then weeks, then seasons. He had always convinced himself that work came first, that his long hours, his growing business, his obligations were for her. But in truth, he was avoiding something deeper. He didn't know how to be a father. Not really. And perhaps, somewhere inside, he feared becoming like his own mother. Distant, cryptic, unreachable. So when his phone rang, her name glowing on the screen, his heart seized. Lily? He answered, voice unsteady. Hi, came her voice, older somehow, not a child's voice anymore. I got a letter from Grandma Eleanor. James nearly dropped the phone. From Eleanor? How? She's... He faltered. Dead. I know, Lily said, but it came to my school. No return address, just my name, and she knew things. The handwriting was unmistakable, Eleanor's. Lily, it began, you don't know me, but I know you. I've watched you grow from afar, just as I once watched your father grow, and just like him, I've made mistakes. But I see the pattern, and I won't let it repeat. The letter went on, recounting Eleanor's own estrangement from James, her regrets, and, most notably, a warning. Don't wait until it's too late. Your father is running from something, just like I did, and that path ends in emptiness. Don't let him turn into me, and don't become the shadow of his silence. You have a voice, use it. James looked up from the letter, and Lily's eyes were glassy. Why did she send it to me? Why not you? She asked. James couldn't answer. The weight of the generational pain pressed down on him like a stone slab. All he could think about was Eleanor's voice, echoing through the letter. Don't let him turn into me. He tried to explain, fumbling through memories, guilt, and the half-formed apologies he'd carried. The trust gave Lily ownership of the cabin. Not James, not even as a co-signer. There was also a small card with handwritten GPS coordinates, different from the original map. She wanted me to go, Lily said, her voice hardening. Not you. James felt the cold realization settle over him. This wasn't just about Eleanor and Daniel anymore. Now she was drawing Lily into it, maybe to protect her, maybe to give her the answers James was too late to ask for, or maybe... Father like son. The silence in the car was thick as fog, stretching mile after mile. James glanced at Lily from time to time, but she didn't look back. She was staring out the window, earbuds in, arms crossed. Not angry, just shut down. And it made something ache inside him. She was 17 now. The same age Daniel had been when he disappeared. It wasn't lost on him. They were driving to the second location, the one marked on the GPS Eleanor had left for Lily. The road was unpaved, climbing toward the tree line of an old, forgotten ridge that bordered Eleanor's property. James remembered Eleanor warning him never to venture past that fence line as a boy. Too wild, too dangerous, she'd say. He had assumed it was superstition. But now, he wasn't so sure. At the top of the ridge sat a small wooden structure, no bigger than a tool shed. The trees leaned in close, as if nature itself was trying to swallow it whole. The door creaked as James pushed it open. Inside was dust, still. Inside the box were papers and a flash drive. On it, video files, labeled simply by year. 2005, 2009, 2013. There were also printouts, copies of school records, psychiatric reports, social worker notes, all for Thomas Grant, a.k.a. Daniel. Eleanor had followed him for years. She hadn't abandoned him. She had been watching, just as she had watched James, just as she was now watching Lily from beyond the grave. And then they found it. A final letter. Not to James, not to Lily, to both of them, together. James, you are more like me than you've ever wanted to admit. I tried to raise you to be strong, but I confused strength with distance. I pushed you away because I thought it would protect you. I made you feel unloved when I was trying to keep you from harm. And I see now you did the same to Lily. Not out of cruelty, but fear. Break the chain. Don't let my... They sat in silence for a long time after that, surrounded by the echoes of Eleanor's secrets. James realized the trust she'd left for Lily. The cabin, the land, the files, wasn't just an inheritance. It was a burden she couldn't carry anymore. A chance for them to write the story differently. But as they prepared to leave, Lily handed James one more piece of paper from the box. Coordinates again. New ones. She wanted us to find something else, Lily said. She called it the confession. James looked down at the numbers and his pulse ticked upward. It led to the one place Eleanor had never done. The final confession. The woods felt different this time, quieter, but not in a peaceful way, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. James and Lily followed the last set of coordinates to the edge of a long-forgotten trail barely visible beneath decades of undergrowth. It led them to a remote clearing, and there, like some ghost from another life, stood a shed so weathered it looked as if it had grown from the earth itself. The padlock was rusted but not unbreakable. Inside, it smelled of pine and old secrets. There was no furniture, no windows, only a single metal box on the floor. James opened it with trembling hands, half afraid of what he might. Tape 1 to 1992. A much younger Eleanor, seated in the same cabin they'd found earlier. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were tired. "If you're seeing this, then I'm gone. And I owe you more than letters or clues. I owe you the truth. Not just about Daniel, but about me and what I did." She spoke of Richard Hall, the man in the photograph James had found. He was not just her lover, but a man she had planned to leave her husband for. They were going to start a new life, one that included both James and Daniel, the baby she was pregnant with. But Richard changed. The closer we got to leaving, the more unstable he became, possessive, angry. One night, he showed up at the cabin drunk, accusing me of hiding something. I was trying to protect James. "You were only 8, and I told Richard to leave." Her voice cracked. "He wouldn't. He threatened to take Daniel, said he'd disappear with him. I was afraid. And then he lunged. I didn't mean to, but I pushed. He hit his head on the hearthstone. There was so much blood." She paused, shaking. "I panicked. I buried him. No one ever found out, not even your aunt." Tape 2 to 1998. Daniel is a small boy, drawing with crayons on the floor of the cabin. Eleanor's voice behind the camera. "You're my little secret, okay? Just for us." Tape 3 to 2009. A tearful Eleanor, older, worn by time and guilt. "The state took him when I got too sick." Tape 4 to 2023. The final recording. Eleanor stares into the lens, her face pale, lips trembling. "James, Daniel isn't lost. He's closer than you think." She takes a deep breath. "I orchestrated everything. I made sure he ended up near you. I needed to know if you could love someone you didn't recognize. And you did. You've worked beside him for years. You've trusted him, confided in him. His name is Greg." The tape ends. Silence. James sat frozen. Greg, his assistant of 8 years. The quiet, loyal man who had stood by him through business losses, breakups, and even Eleanor's death. The man who'd offered to help settle the estate. The man who had called Eleanor Miss Ellie once by accident. Lily stared at him. She knew everything, and she made him find you. James wasn't sure whether to scream or sob. He had been searching for Daniel in photographs, maps, journals. Daniel revealed. The knock still echoed in the cabin when James opened the door. There stood Greg. But not the assistant. Not the loyal, mild-mannered man who brought coffee at 9 o'clock sharp, took notes in every meeting, and offered silent support through James's chaotic life. No, this man was something else now. His eyes were tired, but alive, a quiet storm behind them, and in his hand, the final letter. "You knew," James whispered. Greg nodded. "Not everything. Not at first." They sat inside the cabin, Lily curled on the couch between them, silent but watchful. James could barely look at Greg. Daniel, whatever name was real anymore. Greg took a long breath. "She reached out to me 3 years ago. Said my mother had left something for me. That I had a brother. I didn't believe it at first. Thought it was some scam. But then she sent proof. Photos, drawings, a baby blanket with my name on it." He looked down at his hands. "I realized she'd been protecting me, but also watching me. She told me I worked for you. Said she orchestrated it. I didn't understand how deep." Inside was the final letter. 1 page. Eleanor's handwriting, still steady, though faded. "James, Daniel, my sons, you both carry pieces of me and of the man I loved and feared. I gave you both too much silence when I should have given love. But if you're reading this, it means the silence is finally over. James, I raised you in the light. Daniel, I protected you from it. But neither of you had the whole truth. That was my sin. You were never meant to be kept apart. You balance each other, heart and mind, fire and calm. I see it now. I always saw it. That's why I brought you together. If I could go back, I would hold you both tighter. I would choose honesty over fear. But I cannot. So instead, I give you this. A clean slate. Each other. Don't waste it. Eleanor. For a long time, no one spoke. James turned to Greg, Daniel, and for the first time, really saw him. Not the assistant, not the orphan, his brother. Greg looked up. I don't want money. I don't want the land. I just want to know if there's room for me now. In your life.